You can't really talk about work culture, organizational culture, without coming across a pretty famous quote at this point by Peter Drucker. And he says that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Basically, his little quippy way of saying that your strategy is, even if your strategy is important, the culture of your organization is far more important. The catch, though, or the challenge maybe, is that that quote just tells you that something's important. It doesn't tell you what to do about it.
Well, hey, Eric. How you doing?
Doing all right. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. Today, I would love to ask you some questions centered around this idea of a healthy workplace culture. That's something we are very passionate about here at Built on Purpose. So we're just going to jump in. The first question I think is worth visiting is, why is this topic of workplace culture important? I mean, there are lots of things we have to worry about at work, things we're trying to track, keep up with, things that are crucial for success in a business. But why is workplace culture one of those things?
You can't really talk about work culture, organizational culture, without coming across a pretty famous quote at this point by Peter Drucker. And he says that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Basically, his little quippy way of saying that your strategy is, even if your strategy is important, the culture of your organization is far more important. The catch, though, or the challenge maybe, is that quote just tells you that something's important. It doesn't tell you what to do about it. But it's a good place to start. It's actually a common place that a lot of people in this space start, just as a reminder or an anchor to say, there are people who've come before us who have paved the way in industries, Peter Drucker being a huge thought leader, basically, before that term was what it is today, in terms of knowledge-based work. And his idea that culture eats strategy for breakfast has been around for a while. One of the things that makes that very true, just think about how much time, how many hours that we spend at work out of a given 7-day cycle. If we are getting an average of 8 hours of sleep, that's about a third of our hours in a given day and week. Work is, if it's a 40-hour work week, and I know many of us work more than 40 hours, but we'll just talk about it from a 40-hour perspective. 40 hours of work a week, 5 days a week, is about a fourth of all of our time. If a third of our time is potentially going to sleep, and if a fourth of our time is going to work, that's a lot of our hours that we're alive. So it's really important for us to consider, what is it like at work? How does it feel at work? Am I in a place that sustains me, supports me, is healthy for me? And the reality is that there's this kind of cyclical effect that our work affects our health, and our health kind of in turn can affect our work, our ability to work. If we are in a really unhealthy workplace, if we don't have some really incredible personal boundaries, it's going to affect us in our health. It's going to affect us at home. It's going to affect us in a lot of ways. So I think that, and I'm not alone in this, I think that the health of the workplace is so important and has such a big role in people's individual and even family health overall. So that's why, at the bottom line for me, that's why the health of a culture or workplace is as important as it is.
Yeah. Well, what a great quote. It's such a strong one. But I think the word culture, when we talk about the workplace, has become a bit of a buzzword. And so I think it's important for us to break it down a little bit and talk about how do we actually define culture? Because I think people, when they talk about their own workplace culture, I know that it starts with a gut feeling. For a lot of people, they know how they feel about the culture that they're working in, but how can we define workplace culture, and then how can we potentially measure that in a way to track it for success? Like how are we going to maybe influence the culture to make it even better? Because like you said, it's got a huge impact on our lives, our well-being, and it is important. So how do you keep track of that?
Yeah, it really is important, and it can get buzzword oriented. That's a thing that is not too uncommon, though, when something really important is latched onto by a large group. I think about how we can sometimes laugh at the word synergy these days. When that word was really getting popularized, I want to say it was in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where that was really kind of given a spotlight. It was new enough to not feel like a buzzword, and there was a lot of value and merit to the word. But you fast forward 15, 20 years, and it's just been used so much that it almost passes the threshold of helpfulness and can just become something people roll their eyes at if they're not being thoughtful about it. I kind of expect the same thing to happen with the topic of culture, as we just call it culture, if we just use the word culture. I don't think we're there yet. We're not past that threshold yet, but that doesn't change the value of it, and it doesn't change the need to know how to measure it. The challenge is that it's a hard thing to measure, and there's a good reason for that. It's easy to explain, actually. So I like to think of culture in the way that I think of the weather. So if I ask you, what's it like outside? I'm kind of asking you about the weather. What's the weather like outside? You can't really measure what I've just asked you. You can't respond with a single unit of measurement, but you can start to describe the weather. You can tell me what the temperature is. You can tell me if it's windy. You can tell me is there precipitation. But when I talk about the word weather, it's a construct. You can't actually measure the weather. We measure the ingredients of the weather, the pieces of the weather. We measure temperature. We measure wind speed. We measure precipitation. We measure barometric pressure, humidity. Well, culture is kind of like that. We don't measure culture. We measure pieces that make up what the culture is. We can measure things like psychological safety, trust, gratitude across a team, appreciation. We can measure performance. We can measure accountability, conflict. We can measure a lot of these little elements which make up what is it like to work here. Now, culture, in many cases, is talked about through the lens of the internal operation, the staff, the employees, the team members, etc. Culture also, though, affects our customers. Customers have their own experience with an organization, and the culture, especially the really intentional ones, really just exude outward as well. And so we try to use language that's not just about team members, but also about customer interactions. And culture is measurable in a lot of different ways there, too. So we don't measure the word culture. It's just more of a construct. We like to talk about the word culture because it tends to carry with it or have kind of a packaged in one word the implication of a variety of things. But when it comes down to actually knowing the health of a culture, there are specific things we can measure. And the best part is that because we can measure them in different periods of time and track progress, track improvements, or if we're going in the wrong direction, we can track that as well. So that's just a little bit about kind of what we can track with culture and how I would describe it in that way.
Nice. I love that. Okay, so we know that in order to have a healthy culture, we need both a healthy organization and we need healthy individuals. So can you break down for us what is a healthy individual? Like, what does that look like to be a healthy individual coming to work? And then how are we going to define a healthy organization? Ideally, when those two things come together, it's fantastic. But in order to have that, what are some definitions we could work with there?
I like to pull this from a book that is aptly named Make Work Healthy. There's a great simple tool that they being multiple authors who put this book together, use to create definitions, simple definitions of the healthy individual, but also the healthy organization. Because their premise, and one that we agree with completely, is that a healthy organization has organizational pieces that can be measured in terms of its health. Most of the time that has to do with systems and processes. And then you have individuals within the organization that are each individually healthy in their own ways. So they talk about the two kind of aspects of individual health and organizational health. And they use a simple 2x2 matrix. You've probably seen things like that in other places, but there's an x-axis that talks about the health of the person, whether it's low or high, and then the y-axis that talks about the organization's health, whether that is low or high. And then if you ask questions of individuals, and if you evaluate the kind of systems and processes of an organization, you can start to identify if the individuals have high and low health, or if the organization has high and low health. And of course, the ideal is to end up in the quadrant where health is high for both individuals on average and the organizations. I really like the definitions that they give. They're very simple. So when they talk about the individual being healthy, they basically say that a healthy individual is one with the vitality to flourish at work and beyond. And I really like that they have that in the definition, the and beyond part, because in many cases, if we're just kind of compartmentalizing our thought process, we can ask the question about organizational health and individual health and just think about the workday. And that's helpful if you're doing that versus doing nothing. However, we also want the person to not just be able to be healthy here, but be healthy somewhere else too. So I like their definition of saying the individual has the vitality to flourish at work and beyond. Now, on the organization side, their definition is similarly straightforward. It is that it's an organization that enables its people to sustainably deliver on its objectives. So they're identifying that the purpose of the organization, there are objectives for the organization.
Right.
It's not just so people can come to work and have fun. So that has a lot packed into it. There's a lot of being a sustainably healthy organization. There are going to be things like workload considerations, allowing people to work within and around their strengths, having good, decent pay and benefits. If you can offer, the better benefits you can offer, the better the health implications are for the team members. There's just so many things packed into the word sustainably that are important, and maybe even beyond this video. So if somebody's watching this or listening to this, maybe it's worth going and grabbing a copy of that book, Make Work Healthy. To some degree, it can get a little academic, get a little into the weeds, maybe more than you might want to go, but it's really, really interesting work and insightful work. And they go into multiple layers of identifying ways to measure the health of the organization and measure the health of the individual. They have, I want to say it's like 12 different ways they measure that at the organizational level and 9 or 10 at the individual level. And it's just really a really helpful way to start to think about this.
Nice. I love a good book. Okay, so when we're talking about measuring things tied to culture, tied to individuals, overall health, all of this, there are ways you could potentially approach that. Talked earlier about how the culture can be compared to pieces of the weather and pulling those together. What are some tools that people could use, whether that's as an individual or maybe at an organizational level, that could assist them in evaluating the health of the culture or themselves as an individual?
There's really good stuff out there, lots of options. One of them has been a favorite of mine for a number of years, and I've mentioned this person and his books in other conversations that we've had, but 22 years ago, Pat Lencioni wrote a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and most of his books follow a fable format and teach a model of some kind that is intended to help organizational health. That's his whole mission, is to improve organizational health across so many different companies and industries. So he has this model that he calls the 5 dysfunctions of a team. Maybe some of you have seen this. It's this kind of pyramid-shaped illustration that talks about the 5 dysfunctions that are common, but also teaches the opposite of the dysfunction, which would be what you need to have present for organizational health. His models are always incredibly simple, and that's why I like to start with this one. If you just go Google 5 dysfunctions of a team assessment, you're going to find on his website, and maybe some others that at least share the findings, you're going to find a very straightforward questionnaire that you can freely access. It's also in the print of his book, and you can actually just take some time to answer those questions. I would encourage you to do that. If you're in a leadership role, do that with your team, your leadership team. Maybe there's 5 of you on this leadership team. Each of you answer the questions. You average out the answers that you got, and you can start to get a picture of these 5 different layers of health that Pat Lencioni has been teaching from for 20 some odd years. And it's a widely used model. It's very helpful. I have had a tremendous benefit from using it in my own companies, and it's a great place to start. It is simple, and it's very effective and very helpful. And it's the assessment is free. You could just, maybe it's the cost of the book, or maybe the cost of an assessment on a website, but that's $15 to $20 or something. Very accessible for the value you get. Then, if you have some new information in front of you because you've taken some type of survey or assessment, you got to figure out what to do. What are you going to do with what you have learned? In many cases, most leaders, most business owners are not either well equipped to then go take action on that, or they just don't have the time capacity. So in many cases, you're going to benefit from having somebody come help you. That's part of what Pat's company does. That's part of what our business does. But knowing whether you have the time to actually make improvements is a big thing that you have to just be honest with yourself about. So Pat Lencioni's model of the 5 dysfunctions is a helpful starting point. We're working on some of our own tools that have similar goals, where you can answer a relatively small set of questions to get an initial kind of grade or measurement, and even other tools that go much deeper into the organization that are not just intended for a leadership team. Because one of the things that I've found in my own businesses and in the coaching and consulting and training that we've done, the aspirations of a leadership team in terms of the company's culture or health are usually really high. The aspirations. The same group of people who have high aspirations, they have a perspective that's probably lower than the aspirations, hence the word aspirations. So if they were going on, let's say they're grading it on a 100-point scale, like a lot of tests are these days, and in school. Maybe their aspirations are to get that A or A+. They want to be in that 90 to 100 range, and when they actually get to this kind of peak health for their team. And maybe their perception of where they are today is, let's call it a low 80. Say it's an 80 even. The problem in a lot of cases is these leaders stop there, and they try to close that gap between their understanding of their culture and their aspirations for the culture. The reason that's not enough is that you don't have to be a very large organization to have a third incredibly relevant score, which is, what does the rest of the team think about the culture? Yeah. It's just very easy for leadership, and I'm saying this because I've done this. I've experienced it as a leader and an owner. It's really easy for someone in a leadership role to either ignore or in some cases be completely oblivious to the fact that not everybody is experiencing work the way you are. There are individuals, and in some cases teams, that if they took that same assessment, their score would be in the 50s or 60s when they describe what the culture's like for them. So it's important to have kind of those 3 different points of measurement. What are the aspirations? We want to know what we're aiming for. Those are so important. What's the leadership's perspective of where we are today? Also, very relevant, very important. And then also, what's the current score that the rest of the team would give? And how do we figure out how to close those gaps? There are different ways to measure it. I think Pat Lencioni's tool is really accessible, a great place to start. And if somebody's trying to do a deeper dive and get some guidance on improvements, then usually you're going to reach out to an organization that can help you do that. So it's not just the burden of somebody on leadership to work through.
Sure. Well, there are a lot of pieces, moving parts that come together to really create that healthy culture. If I'm a leader watching this video and listening to this conversation and curious about actionable steps, where should I start? Because starting sometimes is the hardest part, right? If you could make a suggestion on like the top 2 to 3 places of those ingredients that a leader could start with in their organization and focus their energy on trying to improve things and make it even better than it is, what would you recommend for those 3 starting points to be?
Yeah. Oh, man. This is a tricky one. The simple answer is actually choosing some type of survey tool and using it, sharing it with everybody on the team. Now, if you have a staff in the hundreds, then start small, but still you want to get large over time. The challenge, though, is that the tool has to be designed to invite real answers, honest answers. In most cases, that means that the tool is designed to support anonymity. You might not know who's thinking some of these things that you go, oh gosh, I didn't know that somebody here was feeling this way about things. So choosing the right tool is pretty important. But one of the reasons that most of these survey tools default to protecting identities here is that people in general have had some pretty dang rough experiences in the workplace.
Yeah.
In many cases, they don't trust people in leadership and authority and power, especially in some big organizations. They don't trust HR because sometimes their experience, or sometimes you can see in media where HR is kind of painted as this group that is just there to protect the company, is just there to gather proof and documentation before they fire you, things like that. So surveys are great and helpful, but a layer kind of beneath an effective survey is what we can just boil down to trust. And we can also add in the term psychological safety. A number of years ago, Google had a research project where they were trying to determine what ingredients are most common amongst the highly effective teams. And at the end of the day, the thing that they found most common is what they called psychological safety, which is there's a little bit of overlap with some of Pat Lencioni's language around these 5 dysfunctions of a team. At the very bottom of that model is not just the word trust, but what Lencioni calls vulnerability-based trust. It's this trust where I feel like I can be vulnerable with you and not feel like I'm going to get attacked for something or super judged for something. I feel like I can trust you with my vulnerability about work or about something else going on. Well, psychological safety there's a little bit of overlap there, but that also has to do with how do I relate to those in power in my organization? How do I relate to the systems of my organization? And so if you're using a survey tool, you might also come up against a harsh truth that people don't feel as safe as you thought they do.
Yeah.
Do. You might bump up against that. And that is a hard pill to swallow sometimes. I've had some tough conversations and coaching conversations with executives and leaders who were really caught off guard when they got a certain type of feedback that people didn't feel like they could just share their opinions about certain issues. Because it's hard when you are always in a kind of go mode, especially as an owner or a leader. It's hard sometimes to pause long enough to look around and notice that there might be some trust issues. And sometimes we need somebody from the outside to come show us that there are trust issues. But that's maybe not the answer of the 1 to 3 tools, but it's something that we come up against so often that I just wanted to kind of almost plant that seed of caution and just kind of get some folks ready. If they're going to pursue some of those survey style tools, they might uncover some difficult realities that they do need to learn.
All right, so what are some recommendations you could make for the team member we would typically call an individual contributor, someone who, in essence, maybe wants to help lead change or maintain a healthy culture within their own team and the broader organization, but they're not officially in a leadership role? What would your recommendation or encouragement be for that person?
I love this question, and I want to start by saying that even if you are not in a managerial role that includes some type of leadership, even if you're not in a role that has the assumption of leadership responsibilities, every single person has at least a leadership responsibility, which is leading themselves. Each of us, no matter where we are, have the opportunity to work on improving ourselves in some way. And that's something that we try to talk a good bit about, because as passionate as I am about helping companies develop sustainable, healthy cultures, I recognize that sometimes people in leadership roles aren't ready for that. Mentally, they're not ready for that in other ways, and I don't want that to be a stopping point for individuals to try to affect change in some way.
Yeah.
There have been a number of different books out there that talk about how do you lead in an upward direction? How do you influence when things maybe seem out of your control? That topic is really valuable. Perhaps one for another conversation we can have down the road. But for today, I want to focus on how can I lead myself? What can I do if I'm not the one in control of our policies or our meeting cadence or our objectives, our culture? What can I do to still have an impact, at least on my workday, and maybe on the workday of those around me, the ones I tend to work next to most of the time? There are two things that I want to point out for this. They're pretty straightforward concepts, and they can blossom into a lot of different directions. The first is to just know yourself better, and the second is to know your team better. For today, I'm going to give you two ways you can do that. Choose one of these and just give it a try in the next week. The first, we've talked about organizational surveys and tools and assessments. Well, let's talk about individual ones for just a minute. There's plenty of data, research to support the case that when somebody works out of their strengths more, they have more fulfilling, happier days and lives. And it hits the bottom line too, because they tend to actually enjoy the work and by default almost work harder because of that. If you don't know what your strengths are, go find out. And there are some really accessible ways to do that. In fact, the one that we use the most here is free. It's a free assessment that it takes some time. It's very thorough on purpose. I mean, it's designed by researchers. It's very thorough, and it helps illuminate your core strengths. So the organization that we use with all of these strength surveys is called the VIA Institute. VIA is an acronym that stands for Values in Action, and their work is based on research that's worldwide, goes into dozens of countries and cultures, and they worked to identify the most common things that culturally were called strengths, and the ones that were shared across all of these cultures. And they ended up with a list of 24, and their assessment helps kind of rise to the surface. What are your top 5 strengths? And they call them signature strengths. If you can take this assessment, which we'll guide you to how to do this, if you can take this assessment and just learn about your 5 strengths, and then ask yourself at the beginning of a day, all right, which one of these top 5 am I going to intentionally try to leverage today? You can start to work from your strengths more intentionally. You'll notice a difference. You don't need anybody's permission to do that. You don't need anybody's money to do that. You can just go learn about those strengths and start to explore, how can I leverage that more? Now, that's a free tool that's out there. If I increase your investment all the way up to $25, there's another tool that we really like. Again, going back to Petrolinghione, it's the 6 types of working genius. It's also fairly strengths-centric, but it very much has to do with work itself. The first tool I mentioned is about life. It's not even just about work. It's about anything in life. This tool, the 6 types of working genius, predominantly is helpful for teams who work together, but it can be really insightful for the individual as well. And if you take that assessment, $25, it can help you find the stages of work that energize you the most. And as you learn a little bit about that, this tool is a 10-minute process. You take the assessment and you have results in 10 minutes. You can learn about what types of work give you energy, what types of work drain you, and that can actually be something else you look at for yourself and say, okay, at the beginning of a day, what do I know about myself And is there anything I can shape or change about my day to allow me to work out of my strengths more? Or maybe there's part of your job where you just have to work from some things that drain you. Well, how can you schedule your day so that you do those when you actually have more energy, knowing it's going to drain you a little bit? These are really accessible tools that if you take a little bit of time, take an assessment or a survey, read the results back for yourself, you've got so much opportunity to affect your work days just right there. Again, you're not at this point, you're not trying to affect your culture, but by intentionally thinking about your time and your energy, that can affect the culture of the team you're in. There's a book that I really like by Marcus Buckingham, and it's called The 9 Lies About Work, or 9 Lies of Work, something like that. And the first thing that he presents, that he aims to debunk, and I think he does a darn good job of it, is the idea that people care about where they work. He says people don't care about where they work. If I leave that there, it might sound a little strange, because I personally really want people to care about where they work. I love the idea of people caring about where they work. That's a big part of our business and what we're trying to do. But what he actually does is he clarifies that when people apply for a job, they care about where they're going to work. They really care about that culture, the purpose of that organization, the leadership within it. They care when they apply for this job. Once they're in their job, though, they care far more about the team they are on, not the whole company. And so that's why I want to also emphasize knowing your team. The same assessment that you did on your own, you could do it in a group. And if you just learn about the strengths of your team, that's another way that you can affect your culture, your daily experience at work, in a way that doesn't require much on the side of resources or permission. It's something that is within your reach, within your influence. If you take one little step aside from the assessments world, there's one more thing I want to mention very briefly, also within your control and within the context of your own growth, and that is to just read books on purpose. Read some books on purpose. The amount of mentorship available to you in the pages of a book is astounding. And if you can pick a good book that's not just something you're going to read on purpose, but you invite maybe a couple of people you work with to read it together, that's another way that you can learn about yourself, because you can reflect on what you're reading. And I've learned about myself because of things authors have written. And then if you discuss books together on a team, you're then also learning again about your team. So those are things that are low investment. Depending on how far you go into it, sometimes the time investment can get pretty intense, but in a good way. But it's basically, you kind of get out what you put in. And all of those things are within reach, no matter where you are in the organization, for many, many organizations.
Nice. That bit about identifying things that energize you and then things that drain you. I mean, that alone is such a gift when you have that realization and understanding just about yourself and the way that you work. So we definitely highly suggest starting there, doing a little research to learn those things about yourself if that's something you haven't explored before. Well, thank you for walking through this conversation today about healthy work culture. Let us know if you have any additional suggestions or ideas, things that you think that would be a great addition to the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. And let us know if you dive into any of the assessments that we mentioned or the books. If you're interested in going through a book study with a group and you are not sure where to start, I have good news for you. We have a course that we're offering for free to you as our listener today. You could do this with friends outside of work. You don't even have to be in the same industry together, but you could also offer to do this with a group of people within the organization where you work or lead. So we'll link it below for you. Take a look. Thanks for listening today, and we'll see you next time.